There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself with armies or siege engines. It lives in the stories people tell about where their rulers came from, in the whispered lineages traced back to gods and heroes, in the sacred gestures a king performs at the turning of the year to ensure the harvest will not fail. In the year 743 CE, across the patchwork of post-Roman territories that would one day be called Europe, kingship was not yet the bureaucratic or constitutional arrangement we might recognize today. It was something older, stranger, and far more dangerous. To be a king in the early 8th century was to stand at the intersection of the human and the divine. To carry in your blood a claim that stretched back beyond memory into the mythological past. And to know that the same sacred quality that elevated you above other men could, if the harvest failed or the battle was lost, unmake you the sacrifice that set things right. Walk with me into that world for a moment. Imagine a great hall somewhere in the Frankish heartland, in what is now northern France or western Germany. The year is 743, and outside, the November mud is thick and cold. Inside, firelight throws shadows across the faces of warriors seated on long benches, their cloaks damp from the ride, their hands wrapped around clay cups. At the head of the hall, on a raised seat carved with serpentine figures whose origins no one quite remembers, sits a man who is not merely a leader. He is, in the understanding of nearly everyone in that room, a living link to forces that preceded Christianity, that preceded Rome, that preceded almost everything they could name. His hair is long in accordance with ancient custom. The Merovingian dynasty, whose last king Childeric III would be deposed this very year by Carolingian coup, had made long hair the visible mark of royal blood for generations. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was not a symbolic humiliation. It was, in the cosmology of the Frankish people, a kind of spiritual castration, a severing of the mystical connection between the ruler's body and the sacred power he carried. This is the world we are entering, a world where the boundaries between history, myth, and sacred reality were not just blurred, but essentially non-existent for most of the people living within it. To understand 743 CE, you have to understand that the people of early medieval Europe did not experience their world the way we experience ours. They lived inside a story, and that story was woven together from threads that we would now categorize separately as history, religion, folklore, and dynastic propaganda. They did not make those distinctions. The chronicles preserved in monastic scriptoria, the genealogies recited by court poets, the legal codes that encoded kinship obligations, and the oral traditions that carried the deeds of heroes and ancestors across generations were all part of a single, seamless account of how the world worked and who had the right to rule it. The idea of the sacred king, the ruler whose body mediates between the community and the forces that govern fertility, weather, war, and fate, is one of the oldest and most widespread in human culture. By the 8th century, it had taken distinctly regional forms across what had once been the Roman world. In Frankish territory, it had fused uneasily with Christian theology to produce rulers who were simultaneously heirs to Germanic warrior chieftains, descendants of figures like Merovech, the semi-mythological founder of the dynasty whose name meant something close to seaborn or born of the sea monster, and anointed servants of the Christian god. The tension in that combination was enormous, and 743 is precisely the year when it broke open into something new. What we know from the chronicles, particularly the continuations of Fredegar and the later royal Frankish annals, is that in 743 the Carolingian mayors of the palace, Carloman and Pippin, set up Childeric III as a puppet Merovingian king after a period of interregnum, and they needed the legitimacy that only a Merovingian body on the throne could provide, even as they exercised the actual power themselves. This tells us something crucial about how kingship functioned in this period. The claim to rule was not simply a matter of controlling armies or territory. It was a matter of bloodlines, of the sacred inheritance that a particular lineage was believed to carry in its very flesh. The Merovingians had been kings for so long, stretching back into the 5th century, that their dynasty had become mythologized. Their origin stories tangled with pagan echoes, sea monsters, divine ancestry, and the kind of wonder-working that the Church tried to channel into Christian frameworks but never entirely succeeded in domesticating. The archaeological and textual evidence we have from this period illuminates how deeply these beliefs were embedded in material culture. The grave goods recovered from Merovingian burial sites, some of the richest early medieval finds in Europe, show rulers interred with objects that carried cosmological weight. The famous grave of Childeric I, discovered in Tournai in the 17th century and partially preserved before its tragic loss to theft in 1831, contained golden bees or cicadas, a horse sacrificed at the tomb, weapons of extraordinary quality, and a signet ring that identified the dead man by name. The horse sacrifice, in particular, points backward toward burial practices common across the Germanic and steppe worlds, practices that Christianity was actively working to suppress in 743, but had not yet eliminated. The dead king was not merely being honored. He was being equipped for a continued existence in which his sacred qualities might still benefit his people, or at minimum, being sent properly into whatever realm awaited him so that he would not return in dangerous form. Across the North Sea, in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that were being slowly consolidated in what is now England, similar dynamics were playing out. The genealogies preserved in documents like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle traced royal lineages back through generations of kings to figures like Woden, the Germanic god of war, wisdom, and the dead. This was not merely poetic flourish. It was a theological and political claim. A king who descended from Woden carried in his blood a connection to the divine order of things. His victories in battle were not just military successes, but confirmations of a cosmic alignment, evidence that the sacred power in his lineage was still strong, and that the gods, or increasingly in this Christianized context, God himself favored his rule. When those victories stopped coming, the question of what had gone wrong was asked not just in military or political terms, but in terms of sacred failure. Had the king neglected his ritual obligations? Had a curse been placed on the bloodline? Had the line run thin? This is not superstition in the dismissive sense we might use that word. It is a coherent metaphysical framework for understanding power, legitimacy, and the relationship between human communities and the forces that govern the natural world. The people of 743 lived in an environment where crop failure, plague, flood, and military defeat were not random events to be explained through secular analysis. They were signs, communications from a reality that lay just beneath the surface of the visible world. And kings were the figures most responsible for reading those signs correctly and maintaining the relationships that kept catastrophe at bay. The scholars writing in monastic scriptoria, men like Bede, whose great historical and theological works had been completed only a generation before, 743, were working hard to translate this understanding into Christian terms, to argue that what mattered was not the sacred blood of ancient lineages, but the favor of the Christian God expressed through proper kingship and correct ritual. But the old frameworks did not vanish. They persisted in the oral traditions, in the burial customs, in the way people understood what a king actually was. In Scandinavia, which lay largely beyond the reach of Carolingian Christianity in 743, The concept of the sacred king was, if anything, more explicit. The Norse sources, written down much later but preserving traditions that reach back into this period, describe kings and chieftains who were expected to perform the blot, the great seasonal sacrifices that maintained right relationship between the community and the gods. The sagas tell us of rulers whose luck, their hamingja, was understood as an almost tangible substance that could be strong or depleted, inherited or lost. A king with strong luck was a king whose fields yielded well, whose raids succeeded, whose people multiplied. A king whose luck had run out was not merely a failed ruler. He was a danger to his community, a source of spiritual contamination whose continued presence on the throne might bring ruin on everyone around him. The chronicles describe, and scholars like Snorri Sturluson later preserved in texts like Ynglinga Saga, cases of Swedish kings who were ritually killed when the harvests failed, their bodies buried in ways that were meant to restore the fertility their living presence had failed to maintain. Whether these accounts reflect literal historical practice or represent a kind of mythologized memory remains one of the genuinely contested questions in early medieval scholarship. What is not contested is that the belief system behind them was real and widely shared. The year 743 sits at a fascinating hinge point in this long story. It is the moment when the Carolingians, who would soon reshape the concept of Christian kingship in ways that echo down to modern Europe, are demonstrating precisely how much they still need the old sacred biology of the Merovingian line, even as they work to replace it. Within a decade, Pippin will take the throne himself, anointed by the Pope in a ceremony that deliberately echoes the anointing of the kings of Israel in the Old Testament. The sacred power that had resided in Merovingian blood will be relocated, not abandoned, but transformed, transferred to the act of divine anointing rather than inherited flesh. It is one of the great conceptual revolutions of the early medieval period. And like most revolutions, it succeeded partly because it was a translation rather than a rejection. The king was still sacred. He still stood between his people and the forces that governed their fate. But now, the source of that sacredness was officially the Christian God, not the bloodline stretching back to sea monsters and warrior ancestors. The daily lived reality of all this, for ordinary people in 743, was both more distant and more immediate than we might expect. For a peasant family in a small settlement somewhere along the Rhine Valley, the specific genealogical claims of the Merovingians or the theological arguments of Carolingian court scholars were far away. But the idea that the king's condition affected the condition of the land was not far away at all. It was woven into the agricultural calendar, into the ceremonies performed at planting and harvest, into the stories told around fires in the long winter evenings. When the harvest was poor, people asked what had gone wrong at the level of the sacred, and the king, however remote, was part of that conversation. When a new dynasty took power and things went well, that success was understood as confirmation of the new order's sacred validity. What the archaeology shows us in the burial sites, the votive deposits recovered from rivers and bogs, the foundation offerings placed beneath the posts of great halls, is a material world saturated with sacred attention. Objects were not merely functional. They carried meaning, history, spiritual charge. A sword that had belonged to a great warrior carried something of that warrior's luck and power. A piece of bone from a saint's body, which by 743 the church was actively promoting as the approved form of sacred object, was understood to work in ways that were not entirely different from how pre-Christian sacred objects had worked, as concentrations of power that could protect, heal, harm, or sanctify. The church was winning this competition in 743. but it had not yet won it entirely. Again, the forms of sacred power it was promoting were recognizable enough to the people accepting them, and that the transition, while real, was also deeply continuous with what had come before. What strikes me most, standing at this remove from that world, is not how alien it is, but how comprehensible. The desire to believe that the people who lead us carry something more than mere talent or military strength. The hope that power is not just force, but is rooted in something legitimate and even sacred. Be the anxiety when things go wrong that something is broken at a level deeper than politics. These are not impulses that belong only to the 8th century. The specific frameworks of 743, the long hair of Merovingian kings, the sacrificed horses at royal graves, the genealogies stretching back to Woden, those are gone mostly. But the underlying human need they expressed has not gone anywhere. We built the world we live in on the foundations those people laid. In the mud of their settlements, in the ink of their chronicles, and the blood of their complicated, sacred, deeply human lives.